Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reflecting on his accomplishments to date in his administration, President Trump recently said, quote, "I think we've done more, perhaps, than any president in the first 100 days." Throughout the campaign and since coming to office, President Trump has repeatedly attacked politicians who are, quote, "all talk and no action." It seems to me appropriate that now that the first 100 days have passed, we should apply the president's standard. Over the course of the campaign, candidate Trump promised to replace, quote, "the very stupid people in our government who don't know how to win with the greatest minds and the best people." He said the presidency was going to be easy, that jobs are coming back, folks, that's going to be easy. He promised a beautiful, terrific plan to provide such great health care at a tiny fraction of the cost, and it's going to be so easy, end quote. He promised to build a wall so fast your head will spin, and that Mexico will pay for it. Just rely on me, he said. He promised to be, quote, "the greatest jobs president that God had ever created, to bring us all together and to create a unified nation, a nation of love," he said. He predicted we're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore, Mr. President. It's too much. He outlined that winning plan in no other place than Gettysburg last October, Mr. President, there on that hallowed ground where Lincoln reflected on his own poor power and wondered whether the world would little note nor long remember what he said there. President Trump, the man who said, quote, "I alone can fix it," outlined his 100-day action plan to make America great again and restore honesty, accountability, and change to Washington. On his first day, on that day, he promised that on his first day, 18 different accomplishments would be achieved. He delivered just 2 of those. Over his first 100 days, he promised to introduce and fight to pass 10 major pieces of legislation. That included a bill to grow the economy 4% per year and create at least 25 million new jobs. It included a bill to spur $1 trillion in infrastructure investment over 10 years. It included a bill to make 2- and 4-year college more affordable, as well as bills to, quote, "clean up corruption in Washington and discourage companies from laying off their workers." Today, more than 100 days into the Trump presidency, where are we? So far, the president's great team has not yet been assembled. There are 465 people, vacancies where there aren't even yet nominees. You can't blame that on anything going on around here. 465 slots still don't have nominees. And of the 10 pieces of legislation he proposed on that day in Gettysburg, Mr. President, he has passed 0. None. In his first 100 days, amidst a Great Depression, FDR stabilized the banks and put 250,000 Americans to work through a new civilian conservation corps. Ronald Reagan rallied the country behind his agenda for taxes and spending, facing an economic collapse that we had, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. Barack Obama cut taxes and made historic investments in infrastructure, clean energy, and education in 100 days. Notwithstanding this history, these facts, President Trump has repeatedly claimed in interviews and broadcasts how well the administration's done during the first 100 days. In fact, on day 90, he didn't even need to get to 100. On day 90, he said, no administration has accomplished more. As evidence for this claim, the president has referred to the 28 bills he has signed into law, laws to rename a VA clinic in American Samoa, laws to make it easier to hunt bears out of helicopters, to improve weather forecasts, to appoint members of the Smithsonian Board of Regents. Those were in the 28 laws. Missing from the list, however, is any legislation that fulfills a single campaign promise that he made, including his promise to repeal Obamacare. He's also taken credit in the absence of fulfilling the promises he made at Gettysburg and on the campaign trail. He's taken credit for a series of executive orders, even though during the campaign he railed against President Obama for using them. He said, candidate Trump said, quote, "We have a president that can't get anything done, so he just keeps signing executive orders all over the place," end quote. In fact, the history shows President Obama turned to executive orders only after years of unprecedented obstruction and after he'd passed legislation through this chamber and through the House. President Trump turned to executive orders in the first 100 days, despite controlling both houses of Congress. A Republican president, a Republican majority in the Senate, a Republican majority in the House, and he has to revert to the very same instrument he was so appalled by in the hands of President Obama. And he still has no major legislative accomplishments to show for it. That is not fake news. That is the truth. And while we're on the subject, it bears noting, I think, that President Obama used his executive orders to advance rights and opportunity for the American people. President Trump has used them to discriminate against refugees and immigrants with an unconstitutional travel ban, to weaken American competitiveness by reversing fuel efficiency standards for our cars, to weaken protections for our national monuments and endanger our economy and our environment by undoing the Clean Power Plan. So not only has President Trump failed to keep his promises, it's actually worse than that. He's actually proposed or supported legislation that would do just the opposite of what he promised. Look at health care, Mr. President. I hope I'm not in need any right now. Look at health care. Over the course of the campaign, and I don't need to tell anybody in America this, we all saw it. Candidate Trump attacked Obamacare over and over. He described it as a disaster that is imploding. So he promised on day one, he said, we will ask Congress to immediately deliver a full repeal of Obamacare and replace it with, quote, something terrific. He pledged to, quote, take care of everybody, to champion what he called the forgotten man, and assured America that, quote, everybody's going to be taken care of much better than they're taken care of now. More than 100 days after taking office, President Trump has not only failed to fulfill that promise, he's not only failed to repeal Obamacare, the House has yet not even had a vote on it, as far as I know. The White House, instead of repealing Obamacare, actually helped write, and he endorsed a proposal that would throw 24 million people, many of them poor and middle-class folks, off their health insurance while slashing $300 million in taxes for the top 2%. That's what's in the bill they're considering in the House right now. It's not a health care bill. That's a tax cut for the wealthiest Americans that's masquerading as a health care bill. That's not the promise that he made the people who voted for him. That's not the promise he made to the forgotten man. It seems in the first 100 days, the forgotten man remains forgotten. Unless by forgotten, President Trump meant millionaires who can avoid dealing with America's health insurance system by paying cash for their medical expenses with the benefit of the tax cut that President Trump has proposed to give them. My point out here today, I want to be clear about, is not to ask the president to fulfill these promises, most of which I opposed when he was running. I'm simply pointing out what he has said is not what he has done, including his promise to build, quote, a great wall on our southern border and force Mexico to pay for that wall. Instead, he asked Congress for $1.4 billion. He asked Congress for $1.4 billion in taxpayer money to start construction. Mr. President, I was part of the Gang of Eight in the Senate that negotiated the immigration bill, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, over 8 months. We had $11 billion of border security. By the time we passed the bill in the Senate, there was $40 billion of border security in that bill. We didn't have, and it was paid for, unlike a lot of stuff we don't do. And it wasn't the taxpayers who were paying for it, it was immigrants who were paying for it, with their fees to this country. Why isn't that a better way of doing it? Mexico's not going to pay for it. They've said they're not going to pay for it. He continues to say that's going to happen. It's just another broken promise. Instead, he came to the taxpayers hoping nobody would notice that he was asking $1.4 billion for the wall. Fortunately, both Republicans and Democrats alike in the House of Representatives and in the Senate rejected it. In particular, members of the House of Representatives that represent border states or represent the border who actually know what's going on down there. I'm sad to say that this inconsistent and erratic approach has spilled over to our foreign relations. On North Korea, candidate Trump bragged that the United States would easily solve the problem. His language. Easily solve the problem without China, whom he called a currency manipulator, whom he said everybody in Washington was soft and he was going to fix it. Then he sat down with Chinese President Xi for 10 minutes and, quote, realized it's not so easy. The president said when he was running, maybe NATO will dissolve and that's okay. He called it obsolete. Then he sat down with the NATO Secretary General and realized that it in fact was not obsolete, his words. At a time when NATO faces new pressure from Russian aggression and American troops are deployed to Eastern Europe to support our partners and our allies in the region, including the soldiers I met 2 weeks ago from Colorado's 4th Infantry Division, we need a steady voice and clear vision from Washington. They need a steady voice and a clear vision from Washington. We need an administration that can face reality instead of one that spins its own. This is not a campaign anymore. This is governing. During the campaign, Donald Trump promised that, quote, there will be no lies. We will honor the American people with the truth and nothing else. Over its first 100 days, the administration has honored the American people. It's been recorded with 488 false or misleading claims. Some people have actually lost count, nearly 5 a day. It has honored them with 100 days of dog and pony shows of CEOs, campaign rallies, and photo ops in trucks on the South Lawn. It has honored the American people with empty theatrics, where Donald Trump, the president, donates a portion of his salary to the National Park Service, hoping no one would notice his proposal to slash $1.4 billion in funding for the Department of the Interior. This administration needs a reset for the next 100 days and the next 100 after that. The president needs to focus on what the American people need and what he said he would provide them, instead of attacking the independent judiciary and the free press and blaming fake news, his so-called fake news, in the effort to obscure a reality that he doesn't want to deal with. He needs to focus on the next generation instead of his daily approval ratings, to focus on the future instead of complaining about how unexpectedly hard the job is or how great his previous life was. And one more thing, a small thing, but candidate Trump loved to criticize President Obama for playing golf. He tweeted about it at least 26 times with lines like, quote, "Can you believe that with all the problems and difficulties facing the U.S., President Obama spent the day playing golf?" Well, President Trump has spent 19 days playing golf so far, even with all these vacancies in this administration, more than Presidents Obama, Bush, or Clinton. But that's not the only record he's broken for the first 100 days, which has included an average of more than 5 tweets a day. Over a month he's spent in this 100 days at Trump properties, over $20 million in taxpayer dollars to finance his personal travel, which is on pace to exceed in his first year what the previous administrations cost the American taxpayer in 8. A better idea than repeating this next 100 days for the 100 days that are coming would be to actually drain the swamp, as he said during the campaign. He could start by releasing his tax returns, which during the campaign he falsely claimed he could not release because of a routine audit. There was no prohibition on his doing the same thing that every candidate in the history of America for the presidency has done. And now that he's put out a health care bill that slashes taxes by hundreds of billions of dollars for the wealthiest Americans and proposed tax reforms that would further deepen income inequality in this country, the least he could do is show the, quote, laid-off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals what the president stands to gain and what they stand to lose from his proposals. And while he's doing that, he should focus on dealing with Americans' rising health care costs instead of trying to take away health insurance from millions of Americans, making it harder for them to see a doctor and take care of their families. He should focus on expanding opportunities in our communities with investments in infrastructure, on helping people compete in the global economy, and reducing the national debt crushing the next generation of Americans. That's why he was elected president. To some degree, that's why all of us are here. At the start of his first 100 days, President Trump promised in his inaugural address that America will start winning again, winning like never before. More than 100 days later, it's really not clear what we have won, but it is clear what we've lost. Civility in our politics, facts in our policy, confidence in ourselves, and 100 days that should have been used to bring this country together and confront our great challenges. The next 100 days must be better than the last because, as our president once said, the American people are, quote, tired of being ripped off by politicians that don't know what they're doing. Mr. President, on this, at least, I completely agree. I yield the floor.